All right, so it's almost 1 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. First off, I'd just like to take a minute to thank all of you for coming to our very first Dev Talks speaker event. This is something that we've been talking about for a long time now, and we have finally arrived. We have finally made it. And I'm sure if I could hear you all, you would be applauding. But for those of you who don't know, this has been something that we've been wanting to do for quite a while. So, the for those of you who are new to DevTalk, let me be one of the first people, if not the first person, to welcome you to our community. DevTalk, if you have not known us or heard of us before, we're a very vibrant community of visual novel and visual novel related professionals who thanks thank you for the inaudible applause in the chat. But we're dedicated to creating opportunities and resources to help improve the visual novel development experience for everyone. And hopefully, the Dev Talks will also be another entry into that voyage as we go forward. Um, the uh, the other thing I'd like to say is that for those of you who are new to the community, we do things year round, not just these events. We also do jams, meet and greets, and other kind of networking events to help people get connected and make visual novels. So if you are here for only this event, there is more to come in both the speaker avenue. You know, we're going to be doing more of these events, considering how great this one's turned out to be, and also we're going to be doing jams and more meet and greets in the future as well. So anyway, I don't I don't really want to delay the talks too much, and that's really all I had to say. If Shino, if you're ready, we can go ahead and start. Otherwise, I can give you a few minutes if you need to get set up. I'm sorry that I dropped it way too soon on you.
Well, nah, I'm good. Yeah, I can go ahead and share my screen.
Fantastic. So,
Yep.
for those of you, for everyone, make sure you are able to see Shino's screen. I am going to be doing that as well, so you guys can take
Yep,
a
I'll
look.
give everyone, I guess, like a few seconds to drop in, and then I can start.
Mm-hmm. All right, I am going to mute so I can get out of your way.
Okay, hi all. I'm Shino. I'm a Yuri visual novel developer. Normally, I'm a director, scenario writer, and character artist, but I also do a bunch of other stuff. Between 2020 and 2021, I released 8 Yuri VNs and also helped do the character art for another one. And I spoke at VNConf earlier this year on the topic of game jams. But today I won't be talking about game jams. Instead, I'll be talking about asset reduction. In other words, making more scenes with less work. But before we get started, let's first define what is a scene. So if you Google it, you'll get something along the lines of this: a sequence of continuous action in which the time is continuous, the setting fixed, and usually does not involve a change of characters. So as far as this goes for VNs, it'll be a package of location, characters, and actions. And to stage a scene with these things, you'll typically need text, audio, and visuals. So when you're making your game probably starts off in your head as a sequence of scenes, a lot of scenes probably, and basically you'll have to knife it down, cut away all the things that you don't actually need, and decide on what the scope of your game actually is. So and then once you have all the extraneous materials removed, you'll have the core of your game. But at a certain point, you won't be able to cut away anything else, or else you'll cut away the heart of what you actually want to make. So then you'll have the scenes that you need to make, the game after you scope it down to a feasible game that you can actually make. But unfortunately, we typically don't have unlimited budget or unlimited time. So, how will you make this game? And that's what this talk will be about: the art of asset reduction. How do you stage more scenes with less work? Basically, I'll be going through a number of tools and methods that you can use to help you depict scenes that will also help you decrease the workload as far as art goes. The talk will mostly be focused on art assets such as background art and character art, going through the topics of how can you use a black screen, sky BGs, cut-ins, partial display, and limited palette. So if some of these words don't really make sense to you, that's okay because I'll be explaining it as I go through each of the sections. So to start off, let's talk about the black screen and sky BG. So these are some very versatile things that are also very ambiguous. After all, a black screen is literally just a black screen, nothing on the screen, and sky BGs are literally just the sky used as a BG or whatever other purpose you want it to be used for. And we can start off with the simplest one of all, the black screen. Essentially, there's nothing on screen, but you can actually convey quite a lot of things with nothing. There will be darkness. The focus will be entirely on the text on screen, and potentially the text box. Although a lot of VNs definitely have text boxes that are already black themselves, so the text will typically be the thing that is in focus when you have a black screen. And that allows you to add a dramatic effect and also force introspection by removing distractions from the player's point of view. There won't be any character sprites or items in the background for them to look at. There's only text, which helps bring the reader into the narrator's world, making you think deeper and deeper into the text itself. Of course, if we needed everything explicitly visualized on screen without text, we probably wouldn't be making VNs, since it's a visual novel, something that uses the words to convey the information as well. The black screen allows for great ambiguity, and it's pretty easy to create. After all, you just open up your image editing software and click the paint bucket and drop it with black. Of course, it also works for different colors such as white, red, or anything that matches with your GUI. But unfortunately, as with anything in this world, there are cons to go with the pros. It's pretty reliant on writing, as there won't be anything on screen aside from the text, and there's extremely limited movement when you're using the black screen. You won't be able to move any sprites around, so the only thing that can move potentially is the text on screen. And like anything else in the world, overuse will lose the effect of the black screen. It's not really that dramatic anymore if the entire game is just a black screen with text rolling across it. So let's move on to the next thing, sky BGs. So they play a pretty adjacent role to the black screen, but in the case of sky BGs, there is something on the screen, and they can actually be pretty complicated or as simple as you'd like them to be. So when you're thinking of sky BG, what is it? Is it just a convenient way to fill the screen for a scene that's just simply too transitory, too short to warrant making the player absorb all the information that comes with the whole new location? Or probably more importantly, make your BG artist draw all the other things that would come with having to depict a scene? Well, yes. But the sky BG is also a great way to convey the passage of time while also showing something pretty on screen. Or just set the mood. Is your character doing something looking at the sky? Well, the sky BG's great for that. And of course, it just adds a bit of fantasy and ambiguity to the scene. If you have something where your player is doing something that can't be easily described using sprites or even a CG, well, the Sky BG will do the describing for you by setting the scene up with the mood that you're trying to convey with the scene. So let's go look at the pros and cons of the Sky BG. So for the pros, Sky BGs are great for setting the mood. They help you convey passages of time so you don't have to waste any text on that. And again, they allow for ambiguity just like the black screen, while accentuating what's going on by having actual visuals on screen. They're great for replacing other assets for short scenes, since you don't necessarily want to make assets for every single two-line scene going on, but you might still want to have something on screen for that moment. They're also a pretty common free resource to use and otherwise relatively simple to create, so they won't typically be a heavy workload on your artist if you're trying to just add in some more scenes to help you move your game along. But unfortunately, again, they're pretty reliant on the writing since you won't be showing that much movement on screen. There won't be characters or whatnot. But if I had to say one thing for this entire talk, it would be that if you don't know what to put on the screen, then you can just smack the sky there and just call it a day. But of course, you probably don't want to be making a visual novel that's just the black screen and a bunch of sky VGs. So let's get into some of the more complex and possibly more useful things. In other words, cut-ins. How do you cut down on the work for backgrounds and CGs. Well, you can use cut-ins for that. I'll be going through three types of cut-ins: background cut-ins, character cut-ins, and SDCGs, which are more like a special mention than cut-ins themselves. But let's get started with the cut-ins. Starting off with background cut-ins. So by background cut-in, I mean the use of a broad setting backdrop with a set of more specific foregrounds that allow one location to radiate outward into many. So if that definition makes absolutely no sense to you, that's okay, because I'll be explaining it with a bunch of examples. So let's take a look at our first example. This is a cut-in of basically some tea table with scones and the tea and all the sugar and all that. And it's meant to convey the setting of a cafe somewhere in London in a steampunk game. So you might think, oh, item cut-ins are pretty common, but how does this pertain to BGs? Well, as it turns out, there's something that I'll be repeating a lot in this presentation, which I call the foreground backdrop heuristic. Basically, there will be a broad setting backdrop, which is a scene setter, that is a more general type of background. And then a scene identifier, the foreground cut in, that is some sort of more specific item, location, or just picture of something that helps the reader create a mental image of what's going on, where the character is. After all, when you're making a VN, you don't necessarily need to explicitly draw out every single part of your location. Instead, what you want to do is set the scene and help the reader get an idea of where are the characters currently located. Simply by showing the teacup and all the other things on the tea table, you're able to get the idea that, oh, the reader, the characters are in a location where they're having tea and scones and whatnot. And the general area they're in is some sort of place in London. That means they must be in some sort of cafe in London. And this is very convenient for many different types of shapes. So previously, the previous example used an item on a table. But you can also use vertical cut-ins, such as street lamps, to tell the players that, oh, your characters are on the street. Or other places, such as a far view. Now, we've already looked at three examples, so this is already three, or four if you include the backdrop locations, which would be a lot of work if you had your background artist create a background for every single one of these locations. But by using a cut-in, you're able to get way more locations out from way less work. And that's great. And of course, whether or not you're using far shots or close-ups, as long as your cut-ins are able to create a mental model of wherever your location is, the cut-in has done its work as a background. Mhm. And what's more is that when you're using cut-ins, they're actually reusable. So in this example, you can notice that the backdrop image is actually different, but the cut-ins are the same. So you might be thinking, well, that might seem a little lazy, right? Your players will notice this sort of thing. Well, in fact, for this example, it's actually intended to show two nearly identical locations as a narrative element. The houses look the same on the inside, but the actual street that they're located on is different. So if you were trying to do this using only full backgrounds, actually it would be a lot harder to do. So, and of course, you can always just use the backdrop BG by itself. So you'll be extracting way more locations from way less images. And considering that BG art is very expensive and also very time consuming, the more you can get out of fewer images, the better. Although that's not to say it works for everything. And of course, you can always still use the Sky BG for the backdrop as well. I love the Sky BG, so I might be mentioning a decent amount of times, but Sky BG good. And you'll have to note that cut-ins are functionally sprites, so if you're thinking that your scene is looking a bit too empty right now, you can always plop in a cut-in there to help identify where the location is and also fill up space. So that's about it for examples for background cut-ins, but let's look at the pros and cons of this. So again, it fills up negative space, and it's great for creating mental models of settings, while still requiring way less art to, at the same time, exponentially increase the number of locations that your characters are able to visit in your game. Also, they're potentially reusable. When you're making assets for a visual novel, you really want them to be reusable, so you have to make less stuff to get more out of it. But again, they do come at a cost. They can take up space because Again, they do fill the same role as sprites, so they can be pretty non-optimal if you have lots of characters on screen, as the cut-ins will be fighting with the sprites for space on screen. And again, as background cut-ins require the creation of a mental model of the location, they can be sometimes abstract. So if you're using a cut-in that you think won't really work out to help the players understand where exactly your characters are, maybe the cut-in isn't the choice for that scene. So that's enough about backgrounds for now. Let's talk about character art. Sometimes you'll have scenes where your character is in a situation that just doesn't really work for sprites, but it would be a little too much to use like as a CG worthy scene. So that's where character cut-ins come in. Let's look at this example. It's a scene where the characters are in a position that's difficult for sprites to portray. You can, of course, move the sprites back and forth across the screen, smush them together close enough to each other that they look intimate like this. But you might think, well, I just don't like how it looks. I want it to be something else. But at the same time, you don't really want a CG for this. It's just not important enough. And your CG budget isn't big enough. And that's where the character cut-ins come in. Again, they can use the foreground backdrop dichotomy, and you just have to ask a question. Can your player make up a mental model using the cut-in without a CG? Can they get the sense that, oh, those characters are somewhere to the side, off at another angle from the character sprites on screen? If yes, then character cut-ins are great to use. And they're of course less art than if you actually drew out a whole CG, or had to draw out full body sprites for just one scene like this. In addition to pairing with normal scenes with sprites, character cut can pair pretty well with CGs as well to basically extract more use out of a single CG. They can show you different perspectives of the character while also acting as a foreground with the main CG as a background, so you don't need to redraw the whole BG of the CG. And even outside of scenes that are more complicated, filled with characters from different angles or CGs and whatnot, they're just great for poses that are difficult for sprites. After all, between drawing a cut-in like this or drawing a whole sprite sleeping somewhere, the cut-in should be way simpler to do. And if you happen to have a lot of scenes with single characters on screen, well, cut-ins are great for filling in negative space, as if you're showing a sprite on screen for a long time, your player might get the sense that, oh, well, the character's not doing anything and they're not really filling up that much space. Why did the scene seem a little empty right now? That's where cut-ins can come in handy. Though, of course, if the character visual on screen isn't important at all, perhaps you can take a look at other options such as the sky BG or the black screen. But that aside, we can move on to looking at some of the pros and cons of character cut-ins. So character cut-ins are great for setting the scene. They allow you to look at the characters from different perspectives, angles, close-ups, and whatnot that are just hard to do with sprites. And also, if you happen to be doing close-ups, they can actually be potentially less art than a full sprite. They're great for filling in negative space, and they can also take a place of a CG as long as you can make your mental model. And considering the fact that cut-ins again act pretty much like sprites on screen, they can allow for more visual change in your scene. But again, they do have their cons. They're only as reusable as you make it, and they are character art. So you have to take in mind if you really need the art on screen. Plus, again with the cut-in equals sprite thing, they are potential clutter if they're fighting for space on the screen with your character sprites. So you have to keep in mind when you want to use character cut-ins. So let's move on to the last type of cut-in, SVCGs. So they're not necessarily cut-ins, but they actually come in the form of cut-ins a lot, which is why I kept it in this section. If you never heard of the term before, SD stands for super deformed, aka chibi CGs. If you're still confused, I'm sure you'll get the idea once I show them on screen. So they're often something like this. A lot of the previous cut-ins I've shown have come in a rectangular shape, so I just decided to show this one to show that you can use any type of shape for your cut-in. But again, SCCGs often use the foreground backdrop dichotomy that I mentioned. A lot of them take advantage of the fact that there is already an existing backdrop going on somewhere in the back, and just use some sort of gradient BG for the cut-in itself. After all, why should you bother drawing a whole other BG inside your cut-in if you're already trying to simplify your art? You might even apply a blur effect to the backdrop to make the scene seem simpler. or add some manga panel-esque stuff that help the scene come to life. Though it does come at the cost of having text in a visual, and SCCGs can quickly become way more complicated, becoming full screen CGs. But between having a full CG in whatever art style that you're having your game in and the SCCG, typically the chibi art will be simpler. And if you have multiple artists on your team, well, you don't have to fight when it comes to art style. So let's take a look at the pros and cons again of SDCGs. So they're very versatile. They can typically be as versatile as CGs and show scenes that are too complex for sprites. And usually they're easier to draw than CGs and can still, like all the other types of cut-ins, rely on the foreground backdrop dichotomy and use existing BGs. They're typically pretty cute and visually appealing. And if you do happen to have multiple artists, then you can split up the roles on your team to SD and normal art and basically make it more streamlined for your team to work on the art pieces. But again, they do have their cons. They typically are pretty low in reusability, like any other CG might be, so that makes it expensive very quickly. I would keep in mind that you probably shouldn't overuse them just so you don't like scope up your game too much. And unfortunately, they do tend to be mostly lighthearted comedic scenes that they're used for. So if you're making some sort of a nitty-gritty dark game, perhaps SDCGs won't be the thing for you. But hopefully all these types of cut-ins can be useful for you in some sort of way to help reduce the amount of art that you have to make. So let's move on to the next thing, partial display. In other words, only making assets that will actually be displayed on screen. After all, your GUI or user interface might be hiding a lot of stuff a lot of time. So why make things that you won't actually even show? Probably the key example of this is the Narcissus games. These games are framed very minimalistically. They're almost entirely told through slivers of BG and CG, uh, and no sprites on screen. Whatever's behind the black bars, well, it just basically doesn't exist. And for lots of viewers, lots of players of this game, it works out great. It feels like a movie. But if you're thinking, oh, that's a bit too minimalistic for me, well, that's okay. You can still use this partial display idea with sprites and all the typical things that come with a visual novel. The main idea is that whatever behind the GUI just doesn't need to exist. So why make it? For example, the BG, or even the sprites themselves. You can crop the BG and the sprites in order to match with the GUI. And really, your players probably won't be hiding the GUI too many times when you're looking at normal text scenes. So why make yourself do extra work? Only make the amount of asset that you actually need to make. And if you're thinking, well, I want the player to be able to see a full screen CG, that's fine. The CGs can fill the whole screen, and you can just make the rest of the assets cut away the extra material hidden by the GUI. If you're thinking, oh, well, all of these examples have like dark GUIs, does it work if you have a cuter looking GUI that's brighter and whatnot? Well, it definitely works. For example, looking at a recently released game, Tales of Grumville. The main limitation of this idea is that the GUI will probably have to span across the whole dimension it's going across. And so it won't really work that well if you're using a GUI that's some sort of cutesy speech bubble or something like that floating around the screen. After all, it'll be a little weird trying to make the art asset with the like speech bubbles missing in your art. But if you do happen to want to do this, it's pretty great in the sense that way less art is required. But again, with partial display, it's very GUI limited and it can be uncommon with dimensions for art. So if you decide to do it, I would say be sure to talk with your artist first and tell them what dimension of art you want, or else they might get pretty confused and end up making a full screen of art anyways, which, well, that's more work for them and you won't be showing on screen. And now let's move on to the last section, the last main section of this talk, using a limited palette. In other words, you should choose your palette. You could choose your palette wisely to reduce your workload and potentially better convey your story, as oftentimes less can be better. So you might be thinking, oh, are you just talking about making a game in black and white, monochrome, or whatever? Well, sure, definitely. That's one example of a limited palette. It can still look beautiful and detailed, and also help you set the mood for games that are horror or noir. But you can actually do limited palette for other things as well, only limiting the palette of certain parts of your art, such as the background. For example, in this game, the background art is limited in color, coming mostly in black and white and gray, in order to convey the mood and genre of the game, which is steampunk in this example. The gray helps convey the smogginess of the location. Or in this game, where the minor character sprites come in basically very simple palettes in order to emphasize the fact that, well, they're minor characters, but we still wanted to show them on screen, but at the same time, they're not really worth the amount of work to, color them in all the way, render them, create character designs that are very colorful. Yeah. So let's take a look at the pros and cons of limited palettes. So again, they do look good. They can help you simplify the character design of characters, and they definitely reduce rendering workload quite a lot. They're great for conveying the atmosphere of your game, whether it be horror noir or some other type of genre, and they do emphasize colors when the colors show up on the screen. But as with anything else, they do come with their pros and cons, definitely cons. When it comes to limited palettes, well, by definition, the color is limited, which causes the issue of risking blandness in your game. Additionally, if you're making a game that has very detailed art, this can cause a lack of visual contrast, which makes it harder for your reader to parse exactly what's going on in your game. So I would be careful when it comes to choosing your palette, and be sure to consult with your artist before you dive into deciding, oh, I'm going to make my game this palette or whatnot. Because if you choose it wisely, it can be great. If you choose it poorly, well, there might be some problems coming in. And that's about it for the main section, but I'd like to mention some special mentions for things that can help you reduce the amount of work they have to do to create your assets for your game. First off, filtered photos. So, if you don't really have the budget to get a lot of BGs, filtered photos are a pretty good way to go. Additionally, if you're using a pretty common art style, such as the anime type of art style, online assets are also a very handy tool. After all, why spend your time creating yet another Sky BG when basically every single asset pack on the internet has some sort of Sky BG in the typical anime style? And lastly, you should just shamelessly reuse things. Naturally, you'll want to be reusing things within a single project, such as your BGs across scenes that are using the same location and whatnot, but you can actually keep in mind this for future projects as well. For example, reusing your GUI, reskinning it, and basically just reusing it again and again and again for years on end. There's no shame in doing this, and it can actually help you build your brand as the developer that uses this type of GUI that your players are used to. If you're making minigames, well, there's no shame in reusing and reskinning your minigames either. And of course, it does help create the image of, oh, you're the developer with that game. I love those games. And you can even go as far as to reuse and reskin your characters. Although this one I might be a little hesitant on, but it's really up to you if you want to reuse it. And it has definitely worked out for some devs out there, so I don't see why not. As long as you decide on what things you want to reuse and why you want to reuse it, there's no shame in shamelessly reusing it, and you'll definitely be able to save out a lot of work for yourself and for your team when you reuse things. So, if that's been a lot of things I just thrown at you and you're a little overwhelmed, let's just go through some key points as to how to use these things and when you should use these things. So, probably the number one thing is that you should prioritize the reusable assets and make sure that you're displaying the important scenes first. The scenes that are not that important, well, feel free to use the black screen or the Sky BG to do it. Be sure to maintain your aesthetic and avoid clutter. While I went through a pretty long section about cut ins, again, are something that can add clutter if you happen to have lots of characters on screen a lot of the time. So, just because you see this, don't always use it. And, of course, you might think, oh, what a nice set of tools in order to create more locations and scenes. Well, be sure that do not scope up your game. Aim for your set goal that I mentioned in the beginning. You'll usually have the set of scenes that you want to make for your game, and then you should be cutting it down to match the scope of the game that you actually are able to make. So, even if you think, that these are many tools that can help you reduce the amount of art that you need to make that game, make sure that you're not scoping up just because you think you're reducing the amount of work you're doing. Because in that case, you end up in a situation where in the end you're still making a lot of work for yourself and potentially not even finishing your game. So, in conclusion, this is just a tool set. It might not necessarily fit your vision, but hopefully it'll be helpful for you to reduce the amount of work that you have to do to stage more scenes. You have your scenes that you want to make. So, before you start working on your game, you should probably sit down and decide on what assets you want to make before starting. There will always be times when you decide, oh, I actually need XYZ location in addition to XYZ thing that I had in my planning. But if you have it planned out, you'll have less of those moments. So go on and make visual novels. Yeah, so yeah, I'm more or less right on time. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this talk, please drop me a follow on Twitter or check out some of my games on it. And I guess I'll go look through some of the questions. Any questions?
Okay, I actually did not prompt them for questions yet, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and Gino could read them out and answer the questions for you.
Okay, so someone asked the question, where do you keep your assets? How do you keep track of them? Do you have a system for this? Um, Personally, I would say that spreadsheets are pretty safe for just tracking your assets. Yeah. Like, I would say that probably when you're deciding on what assets you need, you'll probably first before, like, actually deciding, "Oh, I need XYZ BG," or whatever, you probably wanna go through your characters and make a list of what characters you want sprites and what locations you probably wanna be shown on screen, and then you can get an idea of, like, what assets you'll be needing. Can you use both the character cut-in and background cut-in at the same time? Well, I don't see why not. Yeah, you can mix and match the cut-ins as you like. The main thing with cut-ins is that you just have to make sure that you're not putting too much on screen or else it can potentially become cluttered, which will be hard for your reader to kinda, like, make the mental model of, like, what exactly is going on in the scene on the VN. Yeah, for not safe for work games, do you believe you can tease the viewer by showing less? Yeah, definitely. Like, I think Katie had a talk about ambiguity earlier this year in at VNConf. So if you're like interested in that, I would definitely take a look at that to get more information on that type of thing. Or even though it's like her talk is not about not safe for work games, but just like general ambiguity. Mhm. Mm. Do very colorful neon colors 2 to 3 work for a limited color palette? Yeah, definitely colorful palettes are good for limited color palettes as well. Yeah. I think I had some example that was kinda like that, but then I was like, "Oh, I don't have enough time to to talk since I don't speak fast enough." So I just kinda cut it out. But yeah, I can probably later show some examples of that, like, drop in the chat after the event is over, something like that. And yeah, you can definitely there was a question that, "Can you use a limited color palette for entire game?" I would say definitely, yeah. There's, like, a lot of games that basically just use grayscale for the whole game. So, yeah, if you're thinking about that, it's totally feasible. Yeah, yeah. What are a few tips for picking a good limited color palette? Well, honestly, I have, like, terrible color sense, so I don't really have any tips there. I would say that, like, grayscale is pretty safe, but if you're thinking about something else, perhaps looking at, other examples of games that have limited color palettes could be good. How can you implement this into a 3D style game? I would say that the cut-ins, it would be kinda hard to do, as, like, I guess, like, cut-ins are kinda, like, more like a manga style type thing, but I guess, like, color palette is something that you could use as something to reduce your work for a 3D game. And is it a good idea to ask your artist to create works with larger dimension than your game? Like drawing in 4K even if your game is gonna be 1080p? Yeah, I would definitely say you should probably want your art assets to be in a larger dimension than the actual game, just for, if you wanted to zoom in on anything or anything, like, at any point in your game. I didn't mention it in the presentation, but being able to zoom around your CG or BG is also something that can be pretty convenient for, like, reducing the amount of, like, separate art pieces that you need. Advice for scope knife on minigames, like small size games or like gameplay games. I would say for like smaller games, it just cut away extra characters, as the short length of your story doesn't necessarily need to have that many side characters on screen, and you can probably cut away at a lot of locations. For like gameplay games, I don't really got anything for that. Like if it's not important to the story, perhaps you don't need it. But if you decide that you actually wanted to make it, then yeah. How do you I'm guessing how do you know when it's good to limit scope and when to expand to a full-on CG? I would say it's basically a matter of how many CGs can you afford for your game and how important is the scene to you. Since I would say, for example, you have like 3 pretty important scenes, except one of them is the scene where your characters kiss. And you can only afford to have 1 CG, but you still want to have some sort of custom art for the other scenes. Well, if you think that the kiss scene is the most important one, I would say CG for that one and the other ones get their, like, cut-ins and whatnot. But otherwise, it's just basically a matter of which one do you think is most important. Mm. Someone asked, "What would you do if you already created the first half of the game's backgrounds and CGs in the most labor-intensive way possible?" Um, well, I would say that you could probably still use some of the things that I mentioned here, though it might not necessarily, like, match with the aesthetic of your game. But for example, like the, background cut-ins, like, not only can you just, like, still use the, like, broader backdrop BG as a BG, but if you happen to have, like, a bunch of locations that you still haven't actually made yet that are kinda, like, related to your existing BG, you can always make cut-ins for those if you like. Though, of course, the cut-in aesthetic isn't for every single game, so it's basically a matter of your personal taste.
Okay, I think we have enough time for a couple more questions. I believe we're
Okay.
getting started with Vimi's talk in the next 5 minutes or so.
Okay, cool. I guess I'll answer just like one or two more questions, or I guess these two questions. Any tips for non-artist directors communicate their vision of a project with artists? Mm, well, if you happen to want to do like something like the examples I showed here, it doesn't hurt to just show them examples of games that do the same thing. And yeah, like if you're, for example, trying to describe your CG or character poses or whatnot, yeah, like references are great, but you can also draw like stick figures. Question: can you think of any examples where cutouts, cut-ins, or cropped images are preferable over a full-on CG for aesthetic or story reasons? Um, so I showed a lot of examples from the Liarsoft steampunk games, and honestly, I would say that Liarsoft is probably like not a huge budget company, but they have like more money than most of us here because they can like hire people to sing things and whatnot, and, like full voice stuff. And most of their games actually use cut-ins and type of stuff. So I would say that the steampunk series is a great example of games where cut-ins or cropped images are better for the aesthetic of the story. I can link that in the chat later, or I wonder if Plum works right now. And I guess that should be it for questions, so I can stop sharing in a second.